talking to Cornelius. Conversation 13. What can I say about the world you entered, old man, after you finished your 15 months on the chain gang? As a probation pass holder, you were hired out for work and paid an income. Some of it was cash in hand. The rest went straight to the bank, where it remained until you were given your certificate of freedom. The probation pass holders were, of course, categorised according to their behaviour. The best behaved were given a greater percentage of cash in hand. The worst had most of their income locked away in the bank. I don't know which category you belong to, old man, but I do know the territory where you worked. I know when I go back to my hometown and my eyes drift over the luminous blue contours of the mountain, I am looking at one of your earliest colonial workplaces. All that bush just below the organ pipes, extending down to the brewery at Cascades. Yes, old man, the brewery is still there. Does that surprise you? It's the last remnant of the bully boy empire of that former bankrupt and money-hungry schemer, Peter Degraves. In your day there was more than a brewery up there. Degraves had his hand in everything, a sawmill and a flour mill and a bakery at Cascades. There was a great profit in supplying bread to the probation stations and the female factory, particularly if a percentage of the flour was substituted with ground-up husks and floor sweepings. Degraves had shipbuilding yards at Battery Point. He designed the theatre on Campbell Street and was a significant stakeholder. But building that theatre was hardly a generous philanthropic act. It was just another means of making money for him, and the litigious dramas associated with the theatre could make a pretty impressive play. Degraves was one of the big men in Hobart, and when he came down from his lower mountain kingdom with his men, he usually meant business, and God help any publican who bought their beer from some other brewer. Sir, when a man resorts to anonymous correspondence and uses threats to further his own interest to the injury of that of others, I think it is incumbent upon every man to expose such practices when they come to light. It is upon this principle that I enclose you a letter addressed to Mr. Frederick Moore, Prince of Wales Tavern. This letter, although the handwriting is attempted to be disguised, was at once recognised by several individuals as being in the handwriting of Mr. Peter Degraves. I will only add, it will give the writer of this much satisfaction, as well as no doubt as every right-thinking man, if Mr. Degraves can come forward and honestly declare that the letter was neither written by him nor sent with his consent. I am, sir, yours, etc., Fairplay. Friend Moore, I always thought you had sense enough to see on which side your bread is buttered. Who spends the money? That is the question which you should have considered. But like a fool, you must needs have 2 brewers and show your consequence. Depend on it, old Degraves is no fool, and not easily beat. You will now have to contend with another licensed house in consequence of your folly at the water's side, a bang-up one. The doors and windows are making, the stone quarrying. In 2 months it'll be up, to your astonishment. And this is the result of giving Walker a turn. Ah, what a ninny. An old friend. Colonial Times, 2nd of April, 1847. It might be a surprise to some that one of the great issues in Hobart for most of the 1840s concerned the impact of industry on the environment. Old Peter Degraves needed water as well as cheap convict labour to propel his empire and make his money. He needed water for the brewery, water to turn the grindstones in the flour mill, water to drive the machinery in the sawmill. He needed a strong, ready supply, and he was located in a prime position to capture it just above Hobart. The trouble was, the people downstream in Hobart also needed a constant water supply, and they expected it to be fresh and untainted. Degraves battled against successive governments to gain control of the water. He was blocked by George Arthur and then John Franklin, who both endeavoured to safeguard the people's right to have fresh water. But Degraves' persistence finally paid off when Eardley Wilmot became Lieutenant Governor. The industrialist gained power over the water. He diverted it, stored it, and controlled the flow rate for his own benefit. Captain Alexander Shane, a former Royal Engineer, was given the task of investigating the water issue in 1847. He soon found himself frustrated not only by the powerful Degraves, but a government that now seemed to be subservient to the industrialist. Shane took it to the public, and extracts of his report and Lieutenant Governor William Denison's response were published in the Colonial Times. On the 29th of May 1847, I reported to the Colonial Secretary that in consequence of having received most credible information that some of Mr. Degraves's workmen were in the habit of easing themselves adjoining or into the watercourse that conveys the water from his mill to the filter or reservoir in front of the Cascades female factory, from which the inhabitants receive their supply of water, I yesterday proceeded to the spot and found human excrement on the bank of the watercourse, which from its position must in wet weather be washed into it. Should the workmen deposit their filth into the watercourse, there would be no trace of it. On which the Lieutenant Governor made the following minute. Let Captain Shane cover the drain if necessary. Dirt of this kind is not unwholesome. Instance, the Thames water, which is said to be the best in the world. Let, however, Captain Shane be directed to speak quietly and like a gentleman to Mr. Degraves on the subject, and ask him to prevent his men emptying themselves at the spot mentioned. He must not make this an official business. If he shows himself unable to carry out his duties of his office quietly, without quarrelling with individuals, I must and will remove him. And so you may tell him as quietly as you please, but as decidedly as possible. June 1st, 1847. Signed, W.D. Captain Shane's own remarks are so pertinent that we copy them at once. There was no mistaking, so far as regards myself, the purport of this minute. I could put but one construction upon it, that unless I remained quiet and permitted Mr. Degraves to carry out his measures directed against the rights of the inhabitants, I should be removed. Colonial Times, 3rd of March 1848. In opposition to the remonstrances of the inhabitants of Hobart Town, the Lieutenant Governor is determined to close the tunnel and to supply the city with water from below Mr. Degraves's brewery, mills, pigsties, etc. Any filth that may be mixed with the water not being unwholesome. Hobarton Guardian, 8th of March, 1848. Such was the world you and the other probationers entered and worked in, old man. A world where you all carried the stigma of moral failure and untrustworthiness, mostly for momentary acts of petty theft, while powerful men like Degraves not only acted unscrupulously and with a disdain for the common good, but were aided and abetted by the government. And their actions were no doubt sanctified then, as they are today, under the banner of progress and economic benefit, and never mind the shit in the water that ordinary people had no choice but drink.